And welcome to another episode of What's Your Evidence? I'm your host, Professor Chris White from Marshall University, and with us today is Professor Emeritus Peter Hayes from Northwestern University. He is the author of many books and articles, too many to count, and has most recently been on the Ken Burns, Lynn Novak, and Sarah Botstein documentary series, The U.S. and the Holocaust, which I was just amazed to learn about a few months ago and watch the whole thing through in about 2 days. Um, I asked Professor Hayes to be on the program with us today, primarily because of his involvement in Holocaust research, but also because he's also a frequent commentator for an interviewee and presenter in the media, but also at various universities, and he's an esteemed historian on this very important topic. So welcome to the program, Professor Hayes.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure.
So first, I wanted to ask you, what made you write a book under this title? Why? Explaining the Holocaust.
Well, I think there were two primary reasons. One is that I recognized that there wasn't a book like this out there. We have some wonderful narrative histories of the Holocaust. A lot of them are very long, and even people who read them come away still puzzled by some central questions about the subject. And I had a sense that of what they were puzzled about because I taught a course on the history of the Holocaust I taught it 25 times over my career. And the students came in with the same questions and during the course kept raising the questions over and over again. And because I taught on the quarter system, I had a problem. I had to teach about the Holocaust in 9 weeks. This is very tough to do. And if you start with the beginning and take it to the end and just tell the story with all the details, it doesn't fit. So I gradually built the course around the questions that my students kept asking. And that was partly a chronological structure and it was partly a sort of thematic structure, but it worked. And then when I got to the end of my teaching career in 2016, I sort of said, I have a new way of writing a history of the Holocaust because of the way I taught this course. So why not put that between covers? After all, I'd written the lectures, and of course the lectures were about half the length of the chapters that finally resulted, but it was a good start. And that's why I did it. I just thought that people needed a focused history of the Holocaust. They needed something that centers the key questions that are in their minds and addresses them directly with as much evidence as historians have been able to compile on it.
Well, I appreciate that, and it makes sense that that you would branch into kind of trying to make it more appealing to a broader audience, also kind of make it readable for general readers. Is that what your idea was too?
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
The unicorn of book writing is the literate layperson,
Yeah.
the curious layperson. But this is a book that I thought might reach that audience because after all, when you're instructing undergraduates, you're actually dealing with a kind of diverse audience. Some of them are history fanatics, but some of them are engineers taking a distribution course, and some of them are people in theater and so forth. So you are addressing a fairly broad audience when you're looking at an undergraduate group like that. And I thought that might be transferable to the general public.
And it's such an important topic as well, given this day and age. I don't know if that was, I mean, it seems to me like there is a revival of anti-Semitism. Do you see that?
Oh, surely. The part of the book that we're now 5 years on from when the book was published, and the part of it that I most regret is a paragraph in the last chapter where I'm kind of optimistic about the position of Jews in American society. And I talk about anti-Semitism as being endemic and recurrent, but not powerful. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen that anti-Semitism in our own society is powerful enough to get people killed. So I wish I had written that a little differently. I wish the recent past had unfolded differently from the way it has. We've lifted up a lot of rocks in America, And we've discovered that there are creepy, crawly things underneath, right at home. And so I wish that hadn't happened, but maybe we will now be more on guard against the potential within in our own society.
Sure. And of course, I found a recent interview that you did with the AP, right, about anti-Semitism. It was published, I think, in the Chicago Sun-Times, where I saw it. But you were commenting on Nick Fuentes and others in the media in the past couple months who have gained some attention. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, there's not much to say about these people except that they're buying into age-old mythologies about Jews, and it's convenient for people who are full of anger about anything to link that to particular people doing stuff that makes them angry. And that's what anti-Semitism is. It's a holds not only that Jews are different from everybody else, but that they're dangerous, and they're collectively dangerous. They all work together somehow to hurt the rest of us. Um, it's hard for me to convey my disgust at this sort of attitude, and the sense that it builds on monumental ignorance, not only about Jews, but also about the way the world works. And the ignorance is at the level of a superstition. It's at the level of believing that, if I throw salt over my shoulder, everything will be fine. Only, of course, the effect is the reverse. If I do something vicious to this particular group of people, everything will be fine. So it's rank nonsense. It's recurring now, as it has always in history, in times when some people feel victimized by events, and they look for an easy explanation for what they think is going wrong with them. And the easiest explanation of all is to say some group out there is doing this to us. It's sad in the end, but it's terribly dangerous, in addition to being sad.
And so to go to the content of your book, you spend some time talking about the history of anti-Semitism. Can you comment about what you think the most important elements of that are?
Well, as I just said, I think anti-Semitism is rooted in Western culture. It's rooted in Western culture because Western culture is rooted in Christianity. And animosity to Jews as a collective dangerous group begins with the rise of Christianity. Christianity is, after all, a religion that takes the central elements of Judaism, scripture, covenant, and says, well, we've improved upon those. We have a Bible, but it is not just the books of the so-called Old Testament. They also are the books of the New Testament. We have a covenant. That is a special arrangement with the Lord. Only in Christianity that is open to everybody who accepts the gospel, whereas in traditional Judaism, that was the property of an ethnic group that had made an agreement via the prophets Abraham and Moses with God to be a light unto the peoples and so forth. So Jews were the people who said, no, thank you. We have this already. We don't need the good news and the new dispensation. Rejection is never very comfortable for people who experience it. And early Christians developed a notion that Jews were dangerous to believers because they contradicted the faith. And therefore, they had to be kept at arm's length. And the history of Christianity in the first 1,500 years is basically developing devices that will keep Jews confined. They couldn't be killed because they were once the people of God before the covenant, the new covenant, and before the appearance of the Messiah. But they must be made to suffer because they have said no. And as St. Augustine wrote, the coming of the kingdom of heaven will be heralded by the conversion of the Jews. At the moment that they see the light, and literally the light, then we will know that salvation is at hand and so forth. So Christianity developed all kinds of restrictions on where Jews could live, what things they could do, how much contact you could have with them without endangering your immortal soul, and so on. And that's the heritage. But of course, that broke down in the course of the Enlightenment in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and the notion that all men are created equal, and that they all have inalienable rights. And in the 19th century, as a result of the French Revolution and of various reforms that were made by autocratic monarchs who wanted to make Jews productive and therefore taxable, as a result of these reforms, Jews became legally free. They became the equivalent of everybody else. And European society and the societies that grew out of Europe all experienced this almost as a wave of immigration by aliens. That is, these people had always been there, but they always were separate. And now they could do things that and compete with everybody else. And so you had in Europe in 1800, there were no major Jewish industrialists. There were no major Jewish professors. Jews were an isolated group. But by 1900, there were many Jews prominent in almost all walks of life. And people who in the course of the 19th century watched this liberation, but also experienced certain disadvantages that they had. People who practiced old trades that went out of business when factories came in, like shoemakers or cartwrights or coopers. These people, and then whole walks of life that were disadvantaged by change, mostly agriculture. The prices for German wheat, for instance, German rye, became steadily less competitive in the course of the 19th century because the American Midwest opened up. And all of those grain fields were producing huge bumper crops. So walks of life in which people felt somehow we're falling back. But look at the Jews, they're gaining. This became the basis for an audience for anti-Semitism in the 19th century. Now so it's built into Western culture by religion. It's been reinforced by periods of economic disadvantage or change and so on. And this is the dynamic that is built in. There's this form of hatred which is inherited almost within the culture, but in good times tends to be trivial, and people don't resort to diabolizing the Jews in good times. But in bad times, or bad times for particular groups, there's an audience available for this. So that's why I say this is something that we, at least in Western societies, we can never entirely root out. But we can combat it. We can show people that this is illusory, that it's a false explanation of complicated events, and remind them that focusing hatred like this on a particular group of people is likely to be lethal.
Right, and it's not going to help the attacking ethnicity or nationality as well.
Exactly.
And I like to bring up the example of Rwanda too, where it's really the Tutsis themselves who end up stopping the genocide, and then they're able to be the ones who create the new system of governance under Paul Kagame afterwards, and so the intention of the Hutus, they couldn't even benefit from that at all. And
you can extend that
yeah,
argument to Nazi Germany.
absolutely.
So that, I mean, I'm often asked, what do we do with people who fall into this rabbit hole of blaming the Jews and focusing their hatreds on this? And I always say, let's show them pictures of Germany in 1945. Let's show them what ravage to the perpetrating society comes from this. It's not just that people should look at pictures of Auschwitz and have some sense of the murders. It's also they should look at what happened to the people who did this, what they did to themselves.
Absolutely, and of course that gets to the next part of the chronology of your book, which is why the Germans. Why did it happen there?
Well, I think that Germany experienced a kind of perfect storm in the aftermath of World War I. There was the humiliation of defeat. It was coupled with a series of economic crises. Everybody knows, of course, about the Great Depression, and everybody knows that Hitler comes to power at the very pit of the Great Depression. But 8 years earlier, there was a massive inflation in Germany where people lost all of their savings. The value of the currency was literally reduced to nothing. In many cities of Germany, People were buying things with script that was issued by their employers or with American dollars. So Germany went through a series of economic tumultuous events. And movements like Nazism, extremely nationalist movements that say we can solve our own problems, we don't have to work with other countries and so forth, almost always thrive on conditions like this. So the particular problem in Germany with regard to the Holocaust is not that most Germans were anti-Semites or that a majority of Germans were anti-Semites. In fact, most Germans probably didn't have very strong views about Jews at all. The real problem was that most Germans were not anti-Semites. They didn't think that the fact that Hitler hated Jews was a disqualification for office. They thought, oh, that's rabble rousing that they do, but what's really important is he's going to fix the depression, he's going to fight the commies, and so on. So Germany was susceptible, because of the extremity of the situation the country was in, to a simplified movement that comes in and says, you didn't do this to yourselves. This was done to you by outsiders. It was done to you by the Allies that imposed the Treaty of Versailles and made you pay reparations and so forth. It was done by the leftists who supposedly stabbed the German army in the back and caused the defeat in 1918. And of course, the all-purpose explanation, it was the Jews. They're conspiring with the leftists, they're conspiring with the capitalists to exploit you. So this movement offers this simple answer to everything. And meanwhile, the movement looks very organized. All those stormtroopers marching through the streets, they look like they can get something done. And so in the desperation of the Depression, a third of the Germans vote for Hitler. That's enough to bring him into power. He never got a majority of the vote in Germany. No anti-Semitic political party ever did before World War I. But he is brought into power in January of 1933 by a conspiracy of people around the president of Germany who had the right to make the appointment. And these are mostly large landowners. They're mostly aristocrats who think that Hitler is a non-entity. He didn't even go to college. He's a failed artist. We can control him. And so they persuade the president to appoint him. And within 6 months, he turns the country into a dictatorship. And then what happens is, of course, that he's got a monopoly on the educational system. He's got a monopoly on all the instruments of propaganda. He's got the newspapers, the radios, the theater, and so on. And now he has the power to persuade Germans to believe all the nasty things he believes. And he's helped in that process by the fact that Germany undergoes a massive revival in the 1930s. The Nazis raise the economy and eliminate unemployment by a massive program of government spending to achieve rearmament and to achieve economic security from blockade, which means they create many, many factories to make substitutes for imported raw materials. And the expenditures of this kind lift the economy up, eliminate unemployment, are coupled with diplomatic successes because the French and the British governments are interested in appeasing the Nazis in order to avoid war. And so they give Hitler what he wants. When he marches into the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized, they don't do anything. When he annexes Austria, which the Allies in 1918, 1919 had forbidden, they don't do anything. And then at the Munich conference, when he demands the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, they give it to him. Now, most Germans are intoxicated by this success. They can't believe it. They're achieving economic revival. They're achieving international respect. The German phrase was, "Wir sind wieder wer." We're somebody again. And this becomes what Nazism trades on. So by the time the war begins, and Hitler is in a position to enact his fanatical hatred of Jews across Europe, because most of the Jews of Europe were outside of Germany, he gets in this position, and by then, most Germans are prepared to believe the Führer knows what he's doing. And that the process becomes, in that sense, unstoppable.
And I guess I immediately thought I should rephrase the question, because even though your chapter says why Germany, the the book says why Germany, in the chapter heading, it's really the Holocaust happens mostly outside of it. All right, and that's something that a lot of people get wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, the Jewish population of Germany, when Adolf Hitler comes to power, by Nazi definitions, the population is about 560,000 people. That's less than 10% of the total victims of the Holocaust, ultimately. And in fact, 3/4 of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust come from only 3 countries, all of them outside of Germany: Poland, Lithuania, and the occupied Soviet Union. So the carnage is mostly in Eastern Europe. It's both perpetrated there, and most of the people who suffer are from there. But the instigator comes from Germany.
Right. So the events that led up to 1939, you've established, especially with occupation of the Rhineland and Anschluss and Munich, Czechoslovakia, and then you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. All of these things are almost, they're not really threatening people outside of that region, right? The United States, the Brits, they're not really concerned about this. The Russians aren't either. And it seems like this is a great example of how you can kind of get away with expanding without really threatening without sounding off enough alarm bells too. If there was, and we constantly go back to Munich in particular as a time, and Neville Chamberlain is demonized through history, or at least criticized. Appeasement and all of that is a word that's used. What kinds of lessons do you think could be learned? I know this is a little bit off track, but this is something that certainly comes up in my classes. What do you think could have been done differently? Do you think that some of the Allied powers in Europe or even the United States could have done something to thwart that appeasement?
Well, the classic moment, I think, in most studies of this period is the Rhineland occupation. When the Germans march they cross the bridges across the Rhine, and they go into the area between the Rhine River and the Belgian and French borders. They marched in with orders that if there was resistance if the Belgians or the French had moved troops across the border, they were to turn around and go back. They would have backed off. And so that was a moment. But at that particular moment, France had no government. The most recent cabinet had fallen. So they did not have a new government. There was kind of disarray in Paris. And Belgium is a small country. And England was not interested in 1936 in standing up to Hitler. They thought he could be bought off already because they'd made a naval treaty with Hitler in 1935, the year before, in which Hitler nominally agreed to restrict the tonnage of his warships. Remember, they'd already agreed in the Treaty of Versailles that they weren't going to have these warships, but the British thought they had contained him, and so they weren't willing to fight back. And that's the classic moment. I think after that, it becomes harder to think of a moment where the occupation of Austria, perhaps, but again, by then the German rearmament had gone so far, and German propaganda about the rearmament had inflated it to the point that people were afraid in all of these countries. Everybody was worried about bombing. They were worried that Paris would be laid waste, London would be laid waste from the air. And so the British and the French don't actually get their backbone up until they've run out of options. I mean, they have agreed to let Hitler take the areas where there are German speakers. And then in 1939, he asks for more. In March of 1939, he occupies the rest of what is today's Czech Republic, though there are not major German speakers there. He wants the western part of Poland, which is what his ultimatum is about. There are only a couple of 100,000 Germans there out of millions of people. So it's clear that there's no stopping point. And of course, we now know from a document called the Hossbach Memorandum that was written in Berlin in November 1937, that Hitler was intent on a war of expansion into Eastern Europe. He saw Ukraine and Belarus and the areas going down to the Caucasus as he put it, our India. It was going to be the source of natural resources and so forth. So there was no way of stopping him. The mistake the French and the British made, and it's worth noting that the French and the British are not making that mistake now in relation to the most comparable historical situation, is that they thought they were dealing with a rational person. And with Hitler, they weren't. And to make the comparison explicit, with Putin, obviously we're not.
I like the comparison. Absolutely. It's kind of, it just reminds me of well, there's geographical pressures, I think, that make leaders behave differently, but there's also this idea that you have people that aren't really playing by the same rules. They don't have the same mentality as well. And certainly in neither of the cases were these leaders thinking it through. So now if we get into the period, they're basically the road to the Holocaust itself, once they actually invade Poland and then start to kind of set up the machinery eventually, how do things start to unfold after the invasion of Poland?
Well, I think the key turning point comes a little earlier.
Hmm.
I think the key turning point comes around Kristallnacht, November 1938. And the reason why I think that is that there's a contradiction in Hitler's two chief goals. His one chief goal is to eliminate Jews from German territory. His other goal is to expand that territory. And where he wants to expand happens to be the part of the world which had the largest Jewish population at the time. That is to say, Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, the Soviet Union. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And that means that the Nazis they're chasing their own tail. As they're driving the Jews out of Germany, they're trying to expand Germany to embrace more Jews. The moment at which this contradiction becomes clear to them is 1938, because they annex Austria, and then they annex the Sudetenland. And when they do that, they acquire almost as many Jews as they have driven out of Germany in the preceding 5 years. And that's the moment, I think, where they begin to say, this isn't going to work. We have to think of something else. Just making the lives of Jews so miserable that they leave is not going to suffice. We can trace this actually in their vocabulary, because up until 1938, most Nazi propaganda about Jews talked about removing them from Germany. The German word for to remove is entfernen. And that's the word they used. But in November 1938, there are a series of documents, sources that tell us that leading Nazis began to use a new word. They began to use the word vernichten, which means to annihilate. It first shows up in a meeting in Paris by the number 2 man in the German Foreign Ministry in November 1938, who has lunch with the Swiss ambassador to France, and he says, if the Jews don't leave, they're going sooner or later to their annihilation. And then a couple of weeks later, an American diplomat in Berlin, a man named Raymond Geist, who is the consul at that point, is very well connected with leading figures in the SS. And he concludes, because he's heard them use the word, he concludes that they are intent on the annihilation of the Jews. And then on January 30th, 1939, Hitler gives a speech to the Reichstag in which he uses the word. So the vocabulary changes. And then once they invade Poland, what happens over the next 2 years is a series of more radical measures that don't quite amount to totally wiping out the Jews, but involve killing ever larger numbers of them. The first of these is a plan to put all the Jews on a so-called reservation. The German word is actually taken is Reservat. It's actually taken from the American practice toward Native Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They're going to put all the Jews on a reservation in occupied Poland. There are no provisions for how these people will build houses or anything. About 13,000 of them are dumped in a trial effort, pilot project at the end of 1939 into 1940. Almost all of them die. Then the Germans conclude that won't really work, but we're winning the war. France has just surrendered. Let's use a colony of the French, the island of Madagascar off the African coast. Let's ship all the Jews of Europe there. And this is an idea that the Nazis didn't invent. The anti-Semites have been talking about deporting Jews to Madagascar since about the 1870s. But they took up the idea. The problem was they didn't have a peace treaty with France, so they hadn't yet acquired the island of Madagascar. And they didn't have any means of moving the Jews because Britain was still fighting, so you couldn't send ships or planes and so on. That idea lasts a little less than a year. And by 1941, when the Nazis are planning the invasion of Russia, they decide not so much, they haven't yet decided to kill all the Jews that they already controlled, but they give orders that basically amount, as they move into Russia, to killing a lot of the Jews. And the orders start with killing Bolshevik officials, commissars, and then basically all Jewish males. In June and July of 1941, that's what they start doing. They have several operations groups, or what they're called, Einsatzgruppen, about 4,000 men, 3,000 to 4,000 men who are brought in behind the front of the advancing German armies, and they shoot a lot of the Jews in their paths whenever they can identify them. But by August, they realize that they've been killing the men, and then a lot of the other Jewish men had been drafted into the Soviet armies and were already gone, and that meant that the villages that they were taking over, the women and children were left all alone, and maybe would begin starving to death and so forth. So they then decide that, well, we might as well shoot them too. And so there's this expanding ambit of murder that goes on. And I think by September or October, they have realized that there's no way out of their dilemma of making their empire Jew-free other than turning around and killing all the Jews that were already under their control. And the question is, how do we do that? If you slaughter people behind advancing armies and there are no neutral journalists there, you can conceal that crime. But in occupied Europe, in France, even in Poland, there are diplomats from neutral countries, Spain, Sweden. There are diplomats from allied countries like Italy and Hungary. These people are going to find out what's happening. And so they want to develop a system that they can at least partially conceal. That means you don't shoot people in Warsaw, where you've put them into a ghetto. You deport them from Warsaw to some place. And they already know how to do that, because in 1940, they began doing that in Germany, not necessarily to Jews, but to people who were handicapped, who were disabled, who were regarded as useless eaters. Those people were bused from the various sanatoria where they lived and so forth to 5 particular centers where they were gassed. They were gassed with bottled carbon monoxide, which they could get from chemical companies. And you locked them in a room and you pumped this in, and people died. And so that became the model for what they think of doing with the Jews of occupied Poland and Lithuania who have not already been shot. And so the camps develop as basically an extension of this previous murder program called T4. And the camps are relatively easy to construct. They're generally built they're built in remote sites where there's already the nucleus. There are a couple of buildings that can be converted or something like that. Or in the case of Auschwitz, that is already a camp for Polish political prisoners. It can be expanded at relatively little expense. And then you can deport people to that site. And so Auschwitz becomes the place where the Jews of France and Belgium and Holland are being sent. And so the whole program metastasizes, but the conception of it is developed between the time that they invade the Soviet Union and they decide to kill the Jews. They decide to bring death to the Jews in their paths. And then by the fall of 1941, they decide to bring the Jews to death, the Jews that they already had. And so it's all settled, I think, by, and there are a lot of indicators of this, it's all settled by November of 1941. The actual gassings, the first one occurs on December 6th at a place called Szemno in Poland. And then it's extended to Auschwitz in the spring of 1942. And then there are 3 other camps created in eastern Poland, Belchec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in order. And those are exclusively centers of killing people.
So the Einsatzgruppen are operating in the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, mostly, right?
Right.
And then the Polish Jews, especially the Polish camps, which is where all the extermination camps are, they are also connected by railway to the ghettos in Poland, which have been established since 1940. Right.
Right. Right. Okay. But be careful with the word Polish camps. You'll have the Polish embassy down on you.
Sure.
Yeah,
German
they
camps,
they
right?
were.
Yeah.
They're German camps in annexed and occupied Poland.
Thank you.
They are all, though, on pre-war Polish territory.
Right. And the ghettos, we're talking about hundreds, right? More than 1,000 or so ghettos that were eventually set up, right?
If you're talking about all across Europe,
yeah.
There are no ghettos in Germany itself. People are collected and brought to what they call Jew houses in the big cities. So the particular buildings become sort of pseudo ghettos, but there's no area surrounded and so forth. And they did that on purpose in Germany. They didn't want to create a large impression of Jewish persecution. They wanted to sort of fragment it. Now in Eastern Europe, they didn't care. And part of the difference there is about the attitudes of the pre-war population. And that is, remember what I said about Germany is it's not that there were so many anti-Semites, it's that there were so few anti-Semites. Germans might have been a little disgusted by centers of poverty being created in the middle of their cities. In Eastern Europe, the endemic anti-Semitism was greater. And so there was less popular resistance to the idea of confining the Jews and exploiting them.
And I guess another question I would like to ask is before we get to kind of to the documentary, and this is related to, I think, too, is what kinds of evidence do historians use? I mean, I've heard this portrayed as the most documented crime in history, and yet there are still people who deny it. But at the same time, there is this question of what kinds of historical evidence can students and future historians use, or do they use?
Well, it is one of the most documented events in history. There are key gaps. We do not have a formal memorandum in which Hitler directs his people to kill the Jews, which we do have for the T4 campaign. We do have a written letter where he says these people will be granted what he called a mercy death, and he instructs his subordinates to do it. But we have almost everything else. We have the minutes of the Wannsee Conference, where, in euphemistic terms, this process is discussed. We have the records of the construction, fragmentary, but we have the records of the constructions of the camps. And one of the most telling records of this has to do with the building of the gas chambers at Birkenau, because the chief advisor on that was a man named Kurt Prüfer, who worked for a company called Topf und Söhne, and they made the ovens in which the bodies were to be disposed of. Now, in German, there are 2 words for gassing. One word is Begassung, and that means, fumigating a building. And then the other word is Vergassung, which means gassing somebody to death, killing a person. And there is one document in which Kurt Prüfer is it's a blueprint of the layout of one of the crematoria, gas chambers at Auschwitz, in which he forgets that he's supposed to use the harmless word. And instead, he writes in the little box for the room that is going to be used as the gas chamber, he writes Vergassung.
Mm.
Now, he knew what he was doing. And we have the railroad timetables in many cases for the shipments of people to what sites. We can reconstruct almost every deportation of the 110,000, I think, Dutch Jews to Auschwitz and Sobibor. And more documentation. We have the testimonies of the few people who survived in these places. I think there are 5 people who survived Chelmno. There are fewer there were, at the end of the war, there are 30 or 40 from Sobibor, mostly people who had been part of the rising at the last minute in that camp and then escaped to the forests, and they somehow don't get killed by either the Germans or the locals, and they survived the war. So we have their testimonies. We have the post-war testimony of Germans who participated in all of this. Now, Perry Broad at Auschwitz was one of the most forthcoming in what he told about what happened. And then we even have the orders for Zyklon. That is, we have receipts of what factory shipped how much to which installation. Sometimes to the camps directly, sometimes to what was called the SS Hygiene Institute in an office in right outside of Berlin. And so though we have all of that, but even today, new things come to light. 2 years ago, the descendants of a man named Niemann, who was the number 2 SS man at Sobibor, discovered in an attic a photo album that he had compiled about that camp and gave that to a local archive in Germany and then again to the Holocaust Museum in the United States. And these are the first, all these years later, these are the first real pictures we've had of Sobibor. They do not show the gassing installations, but they do show the perimeter of the camp, the gate of the camp, the railroad station where people were unloaded. This is more information than we ever had before about that. All we had were maps that were drawn of Sobibor after the war by both survivors and by former guards. And so we're learning more all the time, but we have a vast array of evidence. And now, of course, we have things that we didn't have before 1989. That is, we have local records from places in Eastern Europe. We have the police records in Romania of roundups from villages and deportations across into what is today's Ukraine, where many of the Romanian Jews died. In Hungary, the new information is coming out more slowly, but we are certainly finding out about the transmission of orders between Budapest and the provinces as to who was to round up the Jews and where. And then we have the train records in many cases of the shipments that went out in that last paroxysm of killing, where about 325,000 Hungarian Jews were killed at Auschwitz in between May and July of 1944.
Oh, so just over a 2-year period. And
no, that's even shorter. That's a 2 month.
2 months. 2 months. Right. Very rapid. And speaking of those sources too, especially the train records, reminds me of Eichmann. So there are people like Eichmann and Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, and other former guards, one of which was even interviewed by Claude Lanzmann, right? Yep. How do we take those testimonies of these former Nazi officers who were in charge of the camps?
Well, Eichmann, of course, systematically lied. And Eichmann knew exactly what he was doing. He was not engaged in the banality of evil. He was not a mere bureaucrat or technician. He knew what he was doing. He had to be pretty dedicated because, getting those trains was not easy. And there's one moment in 1942 in the occupation of France where Eichmann has a high general in the occupation authority who's completely sympathetic. And that general helps him to get trains for a while. But as soon as that general was relieved and replaced, it became much more difficult for him to get trains. And the same thing happened in the Netherlands. So over time, particularly over time, 1942 is the temporal apex of the Holocaust. More than half the trains that ever went to death camps went in that year. Um, so the trains were hard to get because military needs were so pressing, and Eichmann had to be dedicated. The other people tend to, deniers discredit these testimonies by saying that, for instance, the official you're thinking of in the Landsmann tapes is a man named Suchomel, and
Mhm.
um, they say, well, he was entrapped, he was threatened, he was bribed, so and it's always duress. They tell the people who are interviewing them what they think those people want to hear, and so on and so forth. But this is nonsense. Suhamel thought he was just talking among us. He didn't think anybody was recording that. Just like Eichmann was ultimately discredited by the fact that when he lived in Argentina, he used to meet up with local Nazis, and he told them what he had done, and it was all recorded on tape by a man named Sassen. And so when these tapes came to light, some of them at the time of his trial in the early 1960s, more of them later, it became very clear that they all knew what they were doing and they all thought it was a good thing. So we have it from the horse's mouth, as well as from the testimony of survivors and the many people who somehow outlived this experience.
And in a couple of weeks, you're about to be on a panel that discusses the Eichmann tapes, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are
And,
the ones you're referring to from
that's
Argentina,
what I'm referring to. Yeah.
right? And how do you take the overall effort of Landsman? I mean, I know he's been criticized for things like that, but do you see Shoah as as an accurate depiction of the Holocaust?
Not completely, but it's an indispensable source. Um, Claude Lanzmann had his own hobby horses. All of us do when we write history, I think. And so we sometimes overdo certain themes and underdo others. Um, he was particularly, but when he uses the testimony of that, I'm forgetting the name now, but that last survivor of Shumno, who as a
Oh,
little
sure.
boy sang that's absolutely irreplaceable information. There's nobody else who could have told us that. Um, and so I think Shoah is the place to start to acquire a sophisticated understanding of this. What Shoah tends to downplay is what I would call makeshift murder.
Hmm.
I think the phrase "factories of death" is very misleading because it describes pretty much only Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was not where most Jews died in the Holocaust. About 15% of the victims of the Holocaust died at Auschwitz. Um, Many more, another 35%, died by gassing at the other camps, which were anything but factories of death. They were slaughterhouses. They were like the stockyards of Chicago. Um, and it was not a smooth process. It was not. Um, we imagine that all those people who died at Birkenau came in through that gate that everybody sees the picture of. That gate wasn't even there until May of 1944, by which time more than half the victims of Auschwitz and Birkenau already were dead. They were marched across a field for a mile and a half from where they were offloaded at the main station to two little converted peasant houses. This is before the Birkenau gas chambers were even ready.
Hmm.
The whole thing was improvised, and it was done on the cheap. The only death camp that has anything permanent about it was Auschwitz-Birkenau, because Auschwitz, there were already stone barracks there. And at Birkenau, they started building the barracks they basically cannibalized the village houses. So what we now know as the women's camp at Birkenau has brick walls. But then The whole rest of the thing was built out of horse barracks, which is what was happening at Majdanek. And the few barracks that were even put up at Sobibor and Belchech were where they were storing the loot and so forth. Otherwise, these places were just places where trains pulled in, people were hauled out. Many of them were beaten up right there on the sidings or shot if they were recalcitrant, and then they were pushed into these chambers where they were killed en masse. And the trains weren't even efficient. Usually the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto had 60 boxcars, and they were sent mostly to Treblinka, which could only take 20 boxcars at a time inside the barbed wire.
Mm.
So the other 40 boxcars would sit on sidings for hours, in which people were dying of thirst or hunger. What am I getting at? This was an enormously barbaric process. It was not like an assembly line or a disassembly line, or
Yeah.
so I think we have a misconception about that. And it's important to remind us of how brutal and barbaric this was. That's independent of all the shooting operations, which account for the other 46, 47% of the victims of the Holocaust. People who are just shot down in fields next to ditches by the tens of thousands.
Have you encountered many Holocaust deniers just in, just people that you meet in your life?
Not personally. I have, I taught at a university where there was a conspicuous Holocaust denier on the electrical engineering faculty for many years, a man named Alfred Butz. And I was constantly asked if I would appear and debate him. And I said, are you kidding me? And I knew him. Sometimes we used to show up at the gym at the same time. I knew who he was. That's the only real personal encounter I've ever had. I have, when I've done programs like this, or when I've been on TV, I've gotten hate mail, usually by email rather than by post. So I've encountered them that way. These people are incorrigible. There's nothing you can say to persuade these people that this really happened, and it happened the way I'm saying it did, and the people who did it were these sorts of people with these sorts of motivations. They've always got a way of wriggling out. They've always got a way of saying, "Oh, your evidence is contrived," or so forth, and it's a waste of breath. I think the task of our society, to put it really strongly, is to drive these people back under their rocks.
I agree. And I asked the question just out of curiosity because every once in a while, every few years, I'll find somebody who expresses some type of denialism, and it's usually not extreme hatred, although I've probably met some neo-Nazis in my life who were quiet. But it seems to be people who say, well, I read this book one time, or I heard this thing, and they'll have these variations, say, well, it wasn't the intention of the Nazis to do this, or they have misconceptions about it. They were in the camps, they were there to work, but they died from disease and starvation and exposure, and not from deliberate. How do you respond to people like that?
Well, the evidence is overwhelming that it was deliberate. It's clear to me that the Nazis did not know in 1933. I mean, maybe Hitler knew, maybe Himmler knew, but even that is a little bit murky. They didn't know in 1933 that this is what they were going to do. But it was the logical outcome of what they believed. And as the 30s went on and into the war years, they discovered they could do it. And they had already discovered that almost nobody was going to try to stop them. And then they discovered they could do it. And so at the moment of truth, they say, why not now? I mean, after all, the moment when they're making the decision, they're on top of the world. They've already beaten France. They've already occupied most of continental Europe. They were not yet at war with the United States, though Hitler thought that was coming. And they just said, if not now, when? And because we believe that these people are the root of all misfortune, and these people are the people who caused our defeat last time, let's get rid of them. So, you lay this out logically. You point out um, you point out the other thing I think it's very important to point out is that this was a self-financing process. It didn't cost the Nazis anything to kill the 6 million Jews. They did it out of what they financed it out of the money they'd stolen from the Jews that they then killed. Um, Auschwitz made a profit because they earned more money on the slave labor that they rented out than it cost them to operate the camp over the 3 years, 3.5 years. Um, the the persecution of the Jews in Germany made an enormous profit because they literally stole everything from the German Jews. And in 1939, the run up to the war, those proceeds counted for 5% of the Reich budget. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So it was not hard for them to do this. Another way of realizing it was not hard is the trains. The total number of trains that were used to deport Jews to death camps is, over the whole period from 1941 to 1944, is about 10% of the number of trains that rolled on the German railways every day.
Mm.
So it was tiny, and it was mostly derelict equipment and second-rate stuff and so on and so on. So they could do it, and they decided they needed to. And so the evidence of all of this is overwhelming. And if I thought it was worthwhile to talk to deniers, I'd cite all the evidence, but they can look it up.
I oftentimes wonder about that because I have to say I've met people that, or I've talked to people who were longtime friends of mine, and all of a sudden you bring up the Holocaust and they have a different opinion. And this is mostly in other countries, I should say, too, not in the U.S.
Yeah.
But every once in a while you run into someone in the U.S. talking to them for a few hours, and all of a sudden Israel comes up, and then it becomes something about the Jews in general, and you just kind of have to get away from that situation. But it seems like there are some people out there who are genuinely misinformed, whereas there are people who have a hateful perspective somehow. And I guess it's difficult for me to understand how they would get to that point.
Yeah, educate. Everything we do as educators is reducing the vast extent of ignorance.
Yeah.
I mean, we're constantly just trying to say, things are complicated. If you really want to understand what happened and why, you have to spend a lot of time on that.
Right.
And most people don't have the time. That's why societies support people like you and me, because we're the people who are allowed to have the time to do this.
Yeah.
And then we tell them what we've done with our time. And if they don't want to believe it, we've done the best we can. And fundamentally that's what you're up against. You people of goodwill or people who aren't of goodwill, and people who have open minds and people who don't.
Right. There's no elevator pitch to summarize why the Holocaust happened. It takes time. And as we've seen here, I mean, because you've gone over a lot of detail, haven't repeated yourself once in the past hour, and it took that long to just give a general outline, really. And yet, when you get into the book, it would take far longer than that. And then if you look into the sources that you're referring to as well, it takes even more time than that. This is just a mountain of work that's been done. And it seems to me that you were also up against films. And because there are films that are out there, right, that can be problematic. And of course, I'm speaking in general terms about history, but maybe that's different for the Holocaust. How would you say the Holocaust has been portrayed in general in films?
Well, number one, let me come back to what I said about how barbaric this was.
Yeah.
I don't think film can really show that. People wouldn't look. It's so ghastly. If you staged a film that showed how Shomno really operated, or how Belchech really operated, people wouldn't look. It's disgusting. Spielberg managed to convey some of it in Schindler's List, when he used a lot of locals in the scenes where people are being rounded up for deportation and so on. But the people in the ghettos had been reduced to such misery by the length of their confinement that the color of their skin must have been sallow, because they had no vitamins, they didn't have the kinds of nutrition that they needed. The condition of people in camps at the moment when they fail a selection, they were so totally emaciated. You couldn't find extras to put on a movie set like that. So there's a limit to what film can do. Despite that, you can't condemn film, and the reason why I say that is because many, many, many years ago, we're now talking over 60, I first came into this subject via film.
Mm.
I mean, I saw The Diary of Anne Frank, and I saw Judgment at Nuremberg, and I saw Exodus, and those things, which were made, Judgment at Nuremberg after, but Diary of Anne Frank and Exodus were made before the Eichmann trial.
Mm.
I knew what the Holocaust had been, and I knew, and I had some sense of it. And it was film that connected me to what had happened to the Jews in Europe. It was America that started that, though, because I grew up in the heyday of the civil rights movement and the struggles in Mississippi and Alabama. And so, I had a connection between what was happening in our own society and what had happened there. But it was film that helped me make the connection.
Oh, that's great. And it reminded me too, when you were talking about how difficult it would be to watch a film that tried to approximate the Holocaust, and the ones that have stood. Of course, Schindler's List stood out, but that's not portraying the kind of the typical death camps. The ones that do that, like Escape from Sobibor, and there's one on Auschwitz, The Gray Zone. With David Arquette, I could only get through the first 20 minutes or so there, because it is very difficult to watch. It's kind of just looking at the intensity of the horrors, and whereas Schindler's List kind of has a story about this hero as well, and so it's kind of, which is, I think it's important. What Spielberg did was able to kind of make this available to a broad audience, but it doesn't really inform about the whole Holocaust as well. And the Pianist, I saw that a few years ago on recommendation of a student. And what did you think about that? I found it to be
I thought The
quite
Pianist was very good. It's a very European take on the subject. I think because there are no unqualified bad guys and good guys. There's an ambiguity to everybody, particularly that German officer.
Yeah.
Who is a real character, that is a real person. And he left behind diaries that have been used in many cases. And so I also thought it was extremely effective in reminding people where this happened, because those scenes about what Warsaw looked like at the end of the war, Americans have no idea about this. But more Poles died in Warsaw, particularly in 1944 in the uprising, but more Poles died there than in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how extensive the devastation was to that country. And we have a lot of trouble in North America, partly it's a legacy of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain and so forth, but we have a hard time imagining what happened in that part of the world and how enormous the destruction was. And so I thought that's something that came through in The Pianist, as well as the ambiguity of people's behavior and so forth. The other great Polish film about this subject is called, I think it's pronounced in Polish, Ida, I-D-A. And this is about a girl who, 20 years after the war, is in a convent and wants to become a nun. And the mother superior says to her, okay, but first you have to find out who you really are, and tells her that she was taken in from a Jewish family during the war in the convent, and she has one surviving relative, a judge, who is a part of the communist system. And then Ida leaves the convent for a week to go visit the judge and so on and so forth. And it's an extremely powerful film about Polish-Jewish relations during the war, about Polish memory of the war and of communism and so on. And it's probably the best Holocaust film I've ever seen.
I'll have to see it then. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it is available on. I mean, I think I saw it on a disc, but I'm sure it's streaming somewhere.
I'm sure we could go through a lot more. And before I get into the Lynn Novak Botstein documentary that you participated in, I wanted to ask you about the film Denial. Have you seen that?
Remind me.
I believe it's called Denial. It's based on Deborah Lipstadt's case with Holocaust deniers.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think the casting of Deborah Lipstadt was brilliant. And a couple of the other people in it, Julius, the lawyer, he played by an Irish actor who was terrific as him. The film was, as far as I could tell, accurate about the trial and about what happened. I have talked to Robert Jan van Pelt and Chris Browning, who were witnesses in the thing. I read Richard Evans's account of it. And I had the impression that the film was accurate. Irving is a slimy character, and also I've had my doubts about Irving's work almost from the time that it first appeared. But when he wrote the book about the Nazi Germany, in which he claimed that Hitler had no idea about the Holocaust, then I knew we were dealing with a strange person. And his association, I've heard the tapes of speeches that he gave to Austrian right-wing groups, which are, neo-Nazism encapsulated. So he got what he deserved, and she was extraordinarily courageous in doing it. And Julius was extraordinarily smart in the strategy he followed.
Oh, thanks a lot for that. Yeah, because that's he's certainly someone who a lot of people used to listen to. I don't know if they still do read his work, but people like that who have kind of an audience, and they can sound logical, bringing up things like Zyklon B levels and all that, make it difficult to counter. Sometimes it seems like a lot of the problem with conspiracy theories in general is that because it's not falsifiable, you can't really. There's no evidence that they would accept that could change their mind in that.
Yeah, and they're willing, the business about Zyklon and how much residue is left in the walls of the gas chambers, which is what this is all pivots on. This one problem is, of course, that the Leuschner report that this was based on has been utterly discredited, and so are his credentials. But then how can you measure, remembering that all of the crematoria were blown up? And so the elements have been invading those walls ever since 1945. Let's say ever since November 1st, 1944, which was the last gassing. And then the buildings were blown up by the Germans in December and January, 44, 45. There was the evidence here is a little conflicting. Crematorium number 5 might have still been there when the Soviets arrived, but they blew it up. And so all of these sites are places where water has been seeping into those walls and draining out the residues all these years since. So, the fact that there's any trace of it left there is remarkable. So again, people pick on these little details, and behind all of this is a kind of conspiratorial mindset. That is, historians are lying to us. And you deal with these people and you sort of say, okay, what are we getting out of lying to you? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you're getting the financial support of the Jewish world or something. And it comes out like this.
Yeah.
And I say, and then I say, and this conspiracy is so airtight that thousands of historians in multiple countries are all saying this, right, as instruments of this conspiracy. You believe that? But if you give yourself over to the conspiratorial mindset, the government's lying to me, the press is lying to me, the historians are lying to me, then you're right. There's no argument with these people. They've pre-concluded that somebody's lying to them, so the story has to be different from what the real story is. And this you can't win.
Yeah,
Can't win if you're faced with that.
all we can do is keep up the work. I'm starting a class on the history of conspiracy theories next week at Marshall. My colleague who just retired last year used to teach it for about 10 or 12 years, and so I'm embarking on that subject because I think it's a very important one. And there's just so many of them out there, and I encounter it practically on a daily basis. Some type of conspiracy thinking
Sure.
in the public. So
and the problem is that sometimes we are getting lied to by some people. These days, we're getting lied to, I think, more frequently by the people who believe in the conspiracy theories. But yeah.
Right, as Catherine Olmsted points out, there are cases where there have been conspiracies in the past, and oftentimes those, like Watergate, etc. But it's hard to keep those things quiet too. And I wanted to talk to you before we close up. I've taken a lot of your time, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knows about this incredible documentary series, The U.S. and the Holocaust. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, the historians were brought in as consultants and talking heads. And what was really remarkable is these people had done a lot of research in advance. The scripts are written by a professional historian, Jeffrey Ward, who is a master of getting a lot of information into the most compact possible form. So we found out right away when we were all interviewed that these people had done a tremendous amount of research in advance, that they were not interested in sensationalism. This is the really important thing, because a lot of video productions about the Holocaust or about World War II are done to keep eyes focused on them, and they sometimes are tempted into sensationalism. And these people were absolutely resistant to it. They really wanted to tell the story as soberly as possible. They weren't looking for scapegoats. They weren't looking to pin everything on a simple explanation. And on the subject of the United States and the Holocaust, that the simple explanation scapegoat is always FDR. It's always, he didn't understand, he was a bigot, blah blah blah. What they the thrust of the program, and I entirely approve of it, the thrust of the program is that the problem was not, though there were people at the top of the government who were bigots, and there were people at the top of the government who were unsympathetic, and so on and so forth. The problem was not the top of the government. The problem was us. The problem was the people. And FDR's diagnosis in the 1930s that most Americans did not want to help Jews get away from the Nazis, did not want to intervene with the German government against persecution, were not convinced or even would have approved if they had known of the bombing of Auschwitz. That's the truth. The truth is the American public did not think this was a priority. Saving Jews in 1935 was not a priority, and saving Jews in 1944 was not a priority. And I think they did a marvelous job of conveying that with all the complexities. They brought in all of the right characters into the story. They steadfastly resisted simplification or personification of complicated issues. So I came away immensely with a lot of admiration for them. I really did. This developed over. The project took a long time because the interviews that I did that are shown there were all done in September of 2019. The show was supposed to be ready and by then they had interviewed almost all the people that you see on the screen except Tim Snyder and Daniel Mendelsohn. Those interviews must have come a little later than me. We saw a rough cut in about 3 months later. So we had a sense of where they were going. So we all commented on that and suggested editorial changes and so on. There was another round during the pandemic when we did all of that by Zoom. But the initially it was supposed to be shown in late 2020 or early 2021.
Mm.
Pandemic pushed it all back because they wanted to do original footage in Eastern Europe. They wanted to go look at things, record things. One of the great things about the video images that you see in that documentary is very few of them have been used before. They found archival material about the US in the 30s that I had not seen before. And then they found things about the Holocaust, surviving video material that I had never seen. And then they went and they did their own photographing of sites. And so all of that, the pandemic delayed all of that. And they took their time. And so I really thought it was a privilege to be involved in it. I was really grateful at the way they did not twist anything I said and use it for purposes that I didn't have in mind. I bet most everybody else who's a talking head in that film would say something similar.
It occurs to me too that this one reminded me of the format that they used for the Prohibition documentary, which is also kind of a shorter one than, say, the Civil War, or jazz, or baseball. And in both of these, I feel like it's so compact for telling kind of yet a very impactful and very important story that people can understand. Whereas, as opposed to the Vietnam one, it takes a long time. We have to go through it.
Right.
I've tried to get through it in a whole semester for my Vietnam class, and that's really difficult to do. But this one's really boiled down to its essentials, and it's very rich. I'm afraid that it might be one of the more overlooked ones because you have these really big ones like the Civil War and Vietnam. But maybe it'll get more traction because of the importance of combating anti-Semitism today too.
Well, I think, the Civil War and Vietnam have built-in audiences in a sense. I mean,
Yeah.
most American, I grew up as sort of a Civil War buff. I think a lot of people in their elementary and middle school years are very absorbed in this. When I saw the Civil War one back when it came out in the early 90s, I had already read Shelby Foote. And
Oh yeah.
I'd never seen him. And so and he was mesmerizing. And so,
Yeah.
and then with Vietnam, people of my age lived through it. And I had trouble making myself watch it because I have such vivid memories of that time. And I basically could watch it one episode at a time, spaced out. I couldn't watch it back to back. Like I did watch the one on country music pretty much back to back and so forth.
Mm.
So, but they have built-in audiences. The U.S. and the Holocaust is not as well known a story, so it doesn't have as big an audience. I think their decision to do it in those 3 episodes that's a little bigger than the original plan was. I think they realized when they started doing it that it had to grow out a little bit, but they didn't want to go too far because the story's relentlessly sad.
Yeah.
It's just hard to watch. And at one point we did discuss as a group, or we raised with them, whether it would be better to have 6 one-hour episodes rather than 3 two-hour episodes because it was so sad. But I think they decided correctly that the flow of the story couldn't be interrupted that way. And so you could do 3 units, but doing 6 would be too choppy. And that was how it came out. It's about to be reshown on PBS. They're going to be. I just got a note yesterday that they're doing 3 showings on PBS in January again, and that the BBC 4 is going to start showing it in England. So
Great.
The afterlife. Wow.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I really want to encourage people listening to this to go ahead and get your book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust by Peter Hayes, but also to watch the Burns Novak Botstein documentary series, The U.S. and the Holocaust. It's both of them are incredibly informative. Are you working on anything else in your retirement years?
Oh yeah, I'm trying to finish up a book called Profits and Persecution: German Big Business in the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And that's sort of, my first books were all about German corporations and their and work with the Nazis. And this is an attempt to synthesize what has become a very big literature. And I'm almost done. I have a co-author, and I'm waiting on him a little bit, but I'm almost done.
I understand what that's about.
Yeah. So,
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Peter Hayes, for talking to me today, and I look forward to reading your future work as well.
okay. Thank you very much. Take care,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.